This is Long Beach Community Television.
Imagine vibrating microbes to death. What do we mean by vibrating microbes to death? The shaking of them, the rattling. What could possibly cause this, and where's this topic going to be going? Well, today we're going to discuss exactly that idea and that theory of how would it be possible to vibrate organisms in your body to death without harming you, the host. I'd like to invite physicist Gary Waite.
Hey, John.
It's nice to have you on the program.
Pleasure.
And perhaps we could go into the beginning, how you got started involved in this as a physicist into areas that most people consider medicine or biology.
It's all Roy Tuckman's fault on KPFK radio. One night he was replaying the Bill Jenkins show, The Open Mind. And it was a rebroadcast of an interview with the Rosses, Stephen Laverne Ross of the World Research Foundation. And they were talking about this guy, Raymond Rife, and his microscope and his other discoveries. And they were making all these astounding and unbelievable claims that Rife had done. But I listened anyway. These people have a good reputation for quality work. So they made an offer at the end of the program to send information for a certain amount of money. And so I sent in my money, got the information, started reading it over, and I got hooked. I had to look into it more and more, and I found out that their claims were quite true. Rife had done some truly astounding things in the 20s and 30s.
Because your own classical education stated that it was impossible to achieve.
You can't do the things that Rife did according to classical physics training. You're taught as an undergraduate in physics, you're taught that you cannot take a microscope and see down an optical microscope. You can't see below a certain size level, essentially around 2,000 hydrogen atom diameters is more or less the limit for most visual microscopes. And
Now,
you do calculations to show you can't do that.
Who is Dr. Royal Raymond Rife? Because I just became aware a couple of years of the same gentleman. He's starting to pop up in a number of different circles.
Well, technically he was a microscopist, and he did his work in the early part of the century. As a young man, he went off to Germany. He studied under Zeiss in the optical facilities there in Germany. He became an optics expert. Matter of fact, they were so impressed by him that when he left Germany, they decided to give him an honorary doctorate degree at the University of Heidelberg, I think in 1913, before he came back to the U.S. to show their appreciation of his work. When he came back to the United States, he hooked up with the Timken family out of San Diego, the Timken roller bearings and bearings family, and also the Bridges Carriage Company. Anyway, he became their worldwide tour guide and all-around so-and-so and chauffeur and handyman and the whole thing. And they were so impressed with him that they decided to set up a research foundation right there off the property and set up a state-of-the-art lab for its time where Rife could do his work, build his microscopes and study microbes and further his research.
That's very fortunate at that time.
Oh, very, yes.
Now, Rife then, after that, he started becoming involved in trying to find organisms at very small, like you said, diameters, basically viruses, which apparently we were not able to see unless you have an electron microscope, which literally destroys them.
And technically speaking, you can see a virus with an optical microscope, except that you can't tell if it's a virus or a piece of dirt. You can see a spot, a little glow or something, but you don't know if it's alive or dead because you have no resolution power.
I see.
But Rife invented a new type of optic assembly that got around a thing called Fraunhofer diffraction phenomenon.
And that is basically?
Whenever you send light, which is a wave-type phenomena, through apertures, circular apertures, the mere fact that they have edges around them in a certain diameter causes some of the light passing through the system to be bent in such a way that when you try to refocus it, you do not get a perfectly sharp image anymore. You only get a sharp image down to a certain dimension size.
Interference in some way?
It's an interference phenomenon, but it has to do with focusing down light that's been refracted, but not by the normal refraction of the lens, but by edge effects of the periphery of the optics.
The lens itself, then, basically.
Yes, right.
Now, what did Rife find out? Because that's a dilemma that all microscopists at that time went through.
And still to this day, yes.
And to this day, they still do. What did he do that was so different?
Well, he realized that where the fundamental problem lied in the method by which we were using to magnify. The standard theory of how you should magnify an object was the problem. Once he scrapped that, he was then able to find a solution. I have a drawing here of a
if you could show us
of a Rife
how
microscope.
it's possible, yeah.
This is the overall schematic view that gives you the big picture, and I'll show you another drawing shortly that gives you the fine details. But essentially, there's a standard light source like you'd find in any microscope. You focus the light source down to a tight source. Now, one of the individual different things in his microscope was a thing called Risley prisms, where he would send the high-intensity beam of white light in this Risley prism, and this would then spread the light full spectrum out into a spectrum. So by choosing the rotation angles of these two Risley things, he was able to select what wavelength went up to this aperture right here.
So you got rid of the ones that might be causing trouble.
Well,
no. In some way.
He made another discovery. He found that every microbe had a particular frequency of light. If you exposed it to it, it would fluoresce back another color.
So the actual organism itself is what would be you're getting light from in a way. You'd resonate to make it bright enough.
He'd shine a particular frequency of light on a particular organism, and it would then fluoresce back another color, unique to that organism. So he could identify it only, and then he would focus in on that color only to give a sharp image.
Wow.
So that's what this part of the optics is about, to choose the very narrow wavelength to put here on the specimen, here on the slide. Now, Rife would use a regular microscope objective lens that would gather the light from the specimen and focus it down. Normally, this wouldn't be in a regular microscope. They would all be focused down this way in another optic assembly. This here shows schematically how it works, but you won't understand this until I show you the other diagram of what this section's about. So that's all I wanted to show you, is that there's a standard optics light-forming system, a non-standard, let's pick a particular frequency of light to illuminate on the subject, and then there's his actual microscope assembly that does the trick, getting rid of the Fraunhofer diffraction.
And this is where you're actually going to view it if you're the person
you're right
looking.
up here viewing it. He used matched pairs of exactly the same optics. That was one of the secrets of his device.
So you basically have the same thing you look through on one side is on the bottom on the other side. You know, there's a frontal part that you're looking through is also on the bottom on the other side.
Yes, and if you see the photographs of his microscopes, that's one of the first things you should notice if you're familiar with microscopes.
Right.
That something's wrong here. That looks peculiar, you know.
That looks very odd.
Yeah. Now, what I'm going to show you now is a blow-up of that last section that we really didn't discuss in any detail. And this one will be able to show you the fine details of how Rife's microscope actually works, particularly if I put the picture right side up.
Okay. Now that is...
Yeah, this is a blow-up of that section we were looking at last. So here's a regular objective.
Okay.
And it looks like the light's coming in from this side, but I better start on this side. Here's our sample we're looking at. This is the sample that's being illuminated in this one particular frequency of wavelength of light. And its image is being drawn down here inside this optic, and it's almost converging to where it would normally make an image like in regular microscopes. But just before it's allowed to make an image, at this surface right here, which is a concave surface, as it comes through that surface, it begins to expand. And as you see it crosses, it expands, and as it enters the next surface, it expands even more. As it reflects inside, it expands even more, again and again. So what you're doing is you're taking an image that you were going to focus down into a sharp image, and you're now expanding it, and then at the end you finally focus the center part of the was going to be the image here.
I see.
So by this phenomenon, you get the magnification you're looking for, but because you're doing to the light the reverse of what you did to it here, you're doing the reverse of what you did to it here. You're sending the light in through it this way, and over here it's the same type of geometry, same lens elements, as closely matched as possible. You're sending that same light back through the opposite direction. And it's this passage through the system and its interaction with the edges that gives you the Fraunhofer diffraction problem. By sending that same light back through the identical system in the reverse order, it undoes or suppresses the Fraunhofer diffraction so much so that you can now see down below 2,000 hydrogen diameters. Actually, he was able to get down to around 50 hydrogen diameters optically.
50,000?
No, 50 angstroms, 50 hydrogen atom diameters. So you could see down into to the virus size. Yeah.
What was the magnification called? And wasn't it like they said 33, 50,000? What is
Yeah,
that mean,
it depends how you actually define your magnification, but quite often they say 31,000 diameters. In some places it'll say it's 50,000 power. It's even better if you take a photograph with this microscope, because you were not at the resolution limit in which you can see. The photograph can actually be enlarged and you can still get better resolution because the detail is still there.
Oh, jeez.
So actually you can stretch this technology out to about 400,000 power using photographic techniques.
What's the maximum that we have today with...
Around 400,000 for the best standard lab using microscopes, and you can go higher power on that with very specialized, very high energy microscopes, but they're used for very specialized sampling work on microcell structure, and you can only look at one particular area very carefully, and you know real detail of the reaction, and they're all dead, by the way, too. There's nothing alive.
That's the electron microscope?
It's an electron. There's one in Boulder.
So it's 400,000 magnification, or...
Yes, essentially.
But Rice was able to do this, but the virus should still be alive, essentially?
Yes, he could watch all these things while they were alive in their natural habitat, if it were, be it a bacteria, a fungus, a virus, or a rickettsia. He would study them in their natural life processes.
So basically their motion and so forth. With the electron microscope, we can't see that because
right.
they're no longer functional. You said, why isn't that this microscope, if this was made, and I believe you said it was turn of the century.
1920, he made the first
1930,
version.
1920. Why haven't we heard about this? What kind of documentation do you have to prove this even existed? Because it seems like most people would say this borders on the line of quackery or witchcraft, something, because we've never heard of it.
Well, first off, the regular medical people today trained have never heard of this in general. Okay, Rife hasn't been talked about very seriously for years, since he basically started getting suppressed around 1939, 1940.
Right.
If you want to read about his microscope, the best article that I know of ever written on his microscope was probably the Mu Microscopes in the February 1944 issue of the Franklin Journal. Also, that same article was republished in the 1944 annual report of the Board of Directors of the Smithsonian Institute. It's in there. So if you want to read about his microscope, you can read about it in detail in there. Plus, see photographs from it.
Wow, the Smithsonian Institute.
Yeah.
Because I saw a picture of that in a book, The Can't Secure Their Work, but that was only out of Canada, that book was.
Barry Lyons' book, very good, very good.
Right, and they had a picture of his book, and they also had a picture of it in the Smithsonian, like you said, the article that was there. But and currently in schools, no one talks about this microscope at all in any of the medical schools.
First off, they're just simply ignorant about it. No one talks about it. The doctors quite often come out with medical school with the opinion that if I wasn't taught about it, it isn't important or doesn't exist.
I see.
They're basically trained to be pharmaceutical drug pushers in general. If you're a regular doctor or a specialist, you're trained in a specialty of what drugs or what surgical procedures and whatnot. You're not taught Rife stuff. Rife isn't mentioned at all.
And when you first heard about it, were you skeptical, or?
Oh yeah, of course, because of the claims they were making. But then I started looking into it and found that there was plenty of documentation, all kinds of newspaper articles, books, articles. It's real work. It's just simply been forgotten and or suppressed.
Now, are any of these microscopes in existence today? Is anyone using them?
Rife built at least 6 of them. But you got to remember also that when he built one, sometimes he had cannibalized parts from the last one in the new one, because he was doing it all in his own lab. Why? They weren't sacred to him. That was just building a better one. I need this part to take it out of it.
Right.
So it's hard to say. He built 6 versions, but today there's probably only maybe 2 that still exist. There may be more, but 2 for sure exist. One's in the Wellcome Museum in England in the basement, and they'll deny they've got it, but I know the guy who has ownership rights to it and whatnot, and it's there. It's fine. The only trouble is it's totally out of calibration, so it's not useful until it gets recalibrated. And if you don't understand how the microscope works, you have a hard time trying to calibrate it. The other one's called Universal Microscope, which is the most impressive one. It was called Universal actually because it did several different things. It was not only a great, fantastic microscope, but it was also designed to study crystal structures for crystallography. It also was designed to prepare microscopic samples for examination. So it did 3 different main things in one.
So now where is that one located?
A good question. It's in hiding somewhere, somebody's safekeeping, though it's missing at least 1, if not 2, of the prisms. I only show, this is a very simple, shows only a few prisms in this assembly. And Rife's actual full-blown universal one, there's probably about 3 times this many prisms in the assembly.
Well, wasn't it some 1,000 pieces that were in that universal?
Oh, more than that, 5,000 something. If you count all the nuts, bolts, and screws, and all the fascias and flanges and all the adjustments.
Wow,
It's a
5,000
rather,
pieces.
yes, 5,800 and something or something. It's a rather impressive number of parts.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Now, what was he able to do with this microscope that there were some claims, I believe, in the book it made about what he could see with what we consider microorganisms, and the fact that most people believe bacterium is a bacterium.
That it
and
stays
its
always the way it
morphology will
is.
stay
Yeah.
that way. And
One
a virus.
begets the next of the same kind only.
What was his discovery, though, that was
Well, he
so
was discovered by
original?
watching very carefully and studying. He was known for times to stay at the microscope for 20 more hours, even essentially, except for maybe a little coffee and a men's room break. But he was able to find that most all microbes, bacteria particularly, that when you would change their growth medias with certain kinds of compounds, you would be depleted from it or added to it. He could get the microbe to go through some type of subtle and sometimes not so subtle a change.
Oh, metamorphosis almost.
Yeah,
right?
we call it pleomorphism. He was actually showed clearly on film with still photographs and motion pictures. He could see that this was true. That thing. For the best example, I think, is the BX cancer virus, as he named it.
Okay.
The E. coli bacteria that normally exists in your gut, or it's out in society in common. He found that when you would change its growth media to a thing called Kindle medium, that
yeah, Dr.
the
Kendall.
E. coli bacteria would then develop inside of itself a near virus size or virus size motile spore that it would excrete into the medium. And he called it the BX cancer virus later on because he was able to isolate this from cancers, carcinoma cancers. It was motile because this thing would form inside the E. coli bacteria at the same location where the bacteria has this little hydrogen proton diffusion flagella. Mm-hmm. It's this little motor that's built into the side of this bacteria where there's a little hair out there, and the bacteria uses it for motion. Well, the spore thing would develop inside the bacteria at the location of one of those and be excreted. And this thing then goes swimming off. And this thing was only 750 hydrogen diameters long and 500 hydrogen diameters thick. It's a little ovoid with a little tail on it. And he found that if you were to expose this thing to prolonged ultraviolet radiation, it would become carcinogenic. It would penetrate a cell and cause cancer.
Because of the environment. Basically, part of it would be
I could give you a theory of why it would be that way, but that would take us off the track here.
Right.
Yeah.
But basically, that's the idea. He was able to watch these organisms or microbes, and they actually could change shapes, in other words. Sometimes they would actually alter between bacteria and virus.
Yeah, so they go virus size. You got to be careful. In his day, a thing was a virus if it could go through a filter of a certain size.
Right.
And so that was the definition, because at that time, no one had really discovered a virus yet.
Filterable or non-filterable.
Exactly.
Now,
bacteria were known to be able to only go down to a certain size physically, and so they build a filter that has pore sizes smaller than that. You keep the bacteria on one side. Anything that got through up to the other side, they called a virus. I mean, if you'd get some type of liquid over here, you put it back in a culture dish thing or something, or you inject it into an animal.
Right.
Something would happen to show that something got through the filter, and that was called the virus, even though they didn't know exactly what it was.
It's like a little black box. You don't know what's inside of it. Now, is that true today also? Do they find out, or they have a different definition for virus?
Well, today here's some virus models here.
Okay.
I got 3 of them.
All right. Okay.
And these are the standard sort of virus in the sense that the majority of viruses that infect plants and animals have isosahedral geometry. That's 20 equal faces that fold back and form the thing we call a virus. There are many other types of viruses that don't follow this rule, but for our purposes here today, since this is the majority of the troublemakers for us, we'll just talk about it. And if you want to see what I'm talking about in a slight more detail, I just happen to have some really good duct tape here today.
So this is the shape right
I made the
here.
mistake of buying the good stuff.
And this is the shape right here of the
Yes.
the virus, and has 20 faces, is what you're saying.
I'm just showing the diagram right here real quickly.
Okay.
Here are the 20 equal faces geometry-wise, and if you follow the arrows here and fold it up as it says, you get this geometry here, which is called an isosahedral. And I have 3 different examples of it here. The difference between these different ones, for instance, this one has only 3 proteins on each of the faces.
4.
And this one over here, as you can see, has 9 proteins on the faces, and yours has
4.
4 in that geometry.
Correct.
Now, the
There's
interesting
4
thing to note about that is that if you take a look down the axis of one of these things, you see how the things form closed on themselves rings. There's 5 in that ring. There's 10. I think there's 10 in that ring. And if I flip it over, I can see it's the same pattern again. And I find that one member in a ring here, that's a 5, is also a member of a 10 ring here. And I think if you keep doing it, you find it's many overlapping, interlocking, closed on themselves, periodically spaced protein clumps. And that's the
all
reason,
ringed.
Yeah, and that's the reason why viruses are so easy to kill with mechanical vibrations, because it turns out that whenever you have a closed on itself repeating protein structure, it will support standing wave motions, vibrations, and these bonds between the adjacent proteins are very, very weak.
Is crystalline basically, that's what we're talking about, like with glass, for example. Glass is a crystal, and it shatters quite easily. I mean, you think about it compared to other types of structures. So virus is very similar in much of its nature. Would you like me to hold some of those, maybe?
I was looking for one of the diagrams, which I know I've placed here somewhere to illustrate this principle. And naturally, I've placed things, I think, in a little bit out of order.
Okay.
But here's, here you go.
Let me hold it for you.
Yeah. This shows an individual. More think about it, we better tape it up because.
There we go. That's okay.
Yeah, okay, is that clear? Here we have one of those protein rings closed on itself. Mathematically, we can think of that as each one has a center of mass. That's these little black dots represent. And I can imagine that there's the mass right there, and that it's elastically coupled. That's just the elasticity of the protein. So there's a mass, and there's an elastic cord, there's an elastic cord, and here's a place like the floor, and here's a place like the ceiling. So you can imagine right here, I grab this mass, a steel ball, and an elastic cord, and I pull it back a little bit and let it go. It's going to go
Vibrate.
wonk, wonk,
Yeah,
wonk, wonk.
it's going to vibrate.
That's a standard harmonic oscillator. So you can look at these rings as being made of a collection of harmonic oscillators. Now, if this fist here was one of the proteins, and this fist here is the other one, and I put them together, and I start this wave motion on this ring so that the adjacent members are always going, they call it 180 degrees out of phase. It means one's heading up or one's heading down and vice versa, like that. The most stressful place is right here where they're contacted, where they connect at. That's these places right here and right here, the fittings, between, halfway in between, right there and right there. So what happens at that point is that you get over a certain amplitude, it comes unglued and blows apart.
Right.
So you can destroy these structures exceedingly easily.
So it's bonded in a way, it has a certain flexibility. If it goes beyond that,
It just ruptures. The whole thing goes boom.
and because everything's interconnected, when one part of it goes almost like a
The whole
pyramid,
thing
the whole
goes.
thing goes
One
out.
starts to go, the rest go.
How's this
So-
compared to like when I've heard this, like the Strecker memorandum mentioned the fact a person's voice when they're very loud will crack a crystal glass yet it won't harm the desk that it's on. Is
Well,
it
they're
based
both resonance phenomena. The crystal glass, because its geometry and whatnot, has a particular resonance frequency.
Right.
So if I get it into resonance, so it's mechanically doing this, I get it over a certain load level, it goes
Right.
boom. The same concept.
Same thing happens with that. So now this is what we're talking about with the Rife microscope. You could see these viruses, bacterial viruses, and you were able to basically, it's okay.
Yeah.
You're able
it
to
up.
actually show their vibration and their actually rate of frequency.
Well, what
You'd
Rife
actually be able to watch
what
their-
Rife would do is watch the microbe, be it a virus or a bacteria. Bacteria, incidentally, also have these closed on themselves, circular, closed on themselves protein clump structures, which make them susceptible.
Okay.
Rife would watch these microbes under his microscope while he would expose them to different light flashing rates. This is an old-time X-ray tube, a hot filament and a target with gas in between, and he put a sine wave voltage across it. On each half cycle of the voltage would be one light pulse.
Okay.
1 to 1 to 1. So if I put in 1,000,000 cycles a second, I get out 2 million light pulses per second. So that would make ultrasound, the main component of ultrasound being generated would be 2 million cycles per second of ultrasound. So by very slowly changing the frequency of the flashing of the light carries pressure. When it hits the surface, it puts a pressure on the surface. It carries momentum, I should say. And when it hits the surface, it puts a pressure on it.
Okay.
When the light goes off, the pressure goes off. So it's like this. It's slapping the surface.
Right.
And so he could find a light flashing rate, or I should say, in other words, a ultrasound frequency at which the microbe would come unglued.
That was also the signatory of what that frequency was, that it was naturally vibrating at itself.
Exactly. Right? So he slowly tuned this radio frequency oscillator and watched the microbe until he found the frequency at which the microbe would die or come unglued.
Wow. And so, but at first he had to find the frequency, didn't he? He had to identify it and then
Yes.
note it. Did he take notes on a variety of different viruses and bacteria?
Oh, yes, yes. By 1939, he had found the frequencies, or I should say flashing rates, and therefore frequencies of ultrasound that killed the microbes associated with 52 major diseases.
52 major diseases, including, was that cancer
Oh,
also?
yeah, cancers, all the regular so-called social venereal diseases, the TBs, the arthritis, what do they call it, lupus, trying to think of all those.
Hepatitis?
Yeah, gangrene, what's that one? Leprosy.
Right.
Yeah, let's see, herpes, flu, cold. He'd gone through it pretty well.
And he noted these and he had them written down so that
Yes.
anybody could use at that time.
Well, yes and no. That's maybe someone will have to go into more detail. We only have actually one of his frequencies now in public domain.
And that's which
The one
one?
for the BX cancer virus, the one that was the main cause of cancer in his day. And that's 23,560,000 cycles a second ultrasound.
I see.
But unfortunately, the majority of cancers today are probably not caused by the BX cancer virus anymore. But still important cause, but it's not the main, I don't think, anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
So with his microscope, what I'm understanding is that he was able to observe these viruses and actually determine, not just like some people say, well, he feels better now, it must be he got rid of the flu. He can actually prove that it was gone.
Yeah, he
He
watched
can
it
observe the
disintegrate.
blood sample or whatever and check to see if there's anything left.
Well, he usually didn't do it that way. I mean, he did his work in the lab first, and he perfected it, make sure he had the right frequency, had the right microbe associated with the disease, and then he would try it on people as the last result.
So animal studies first then?
Oh, yes. And all the labs in the rats in his lab died of old age. They didn't die from torturous experiments.
Probably because the frequency
Yes.
generated killed all the...
Yes, he was very compassionate with his animals. Even if he gave them terrible diseases, he made a point of curing them.
Well, I want to thank you for this
John,
first
my
segment.
pleasure.
It's been great. This has been Imagine. Imagine vibrating microbes to death. Exactly what are we talking about? We've gotten some of the synopsis of the microscope and so forth. Now in the second part, let's learn exactly how is this phenomenon, how is this occurring, and how are we able to do so? Thank you. This has been Imagine.
Yeah.